most of the seeks, and the streaming gets faster. But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed, there's a massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style. Either level design gets a little bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, a PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough. With an SSD, though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system memory can be used much more efficiently. On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need a piece of data, it's much too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 gigabytes of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the SSD and use it. There's no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in size. So back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second. No load screens. Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors. More game on the disk and more game on the SSD. And finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive, I probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed. And there are a lot of them when its overhead gets 100 times larger. Conceptually, check-in is a pretty simple process. Data is loaded into system memory from the hard drive or SSD. It's examined. A few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location. At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100 times larger, that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the player moves, and that massive stream of data starts coming off the SSD. So to solve all of that, we built a lot of custom hardware, namely a custom flash controller and a number of custom units in our main chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for smooth and bottleneck-free operation, but also with games in mind. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And while those textures are being loaded, an enemy is shot and has to...
Ojo al slow roll, slow roll a mi tocayo, slow roll a mi tocayo, slow roll a mi tocayo. Ya que me entrenases en un home games y tal, tengo que hacerle slow roll. Te voy a hacer un slow roll aquí, Willow GPO, porque me has ido antes a bustear. Y esto es un pequeño slow roll de chinchar, un pequeño slow roll ahí de decir, ay, le pago, no le pago, le pago, no le pago, le pago, no le pago, ¡pum!
Resulting bandwidth we achieved is is actually 5
¡Ay! ¡Oh!
gigabytes.
¡No!
With
¡No!
a 12-channel interface,
No!
the most natural
No!
size
No!
for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but Flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or re-downloads would be quite low, and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment. Back to the Flash controller. On the other side, it connects to our main custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe. And inside the main custom chip is a pretty hefty unit dedicated to I/O. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but on my 2017 tour of developers,